I am concluding a 7-week session on Introduction to the Spiritual Psychology of the Kabbalah. Today is the last installment. I'm going to go from the Kabbalah of Isaac Luria into how the Kabbalah was translated into the Hasidic movement. As I wrote in my very, brief introduction to today, I feel like we've derived home because my own inner life, my own religiosity, as it were, I call it a post-Orthodox neo-Hasidism. It's not Hasidic in the sense that it's not identifiably Orthodox Hasidic. It's called neo-Hasidic, and of course beyond the strictures of Orthodoxy. So I very much see this as my own religious path for many, many years. And whatever I'm teaching at Or HaTorah or anywhere else, I'm teaching something of the spiritual psychology of Hasidism, even though sometimes I'll be focused on just the, for example, the virtue aspects, the rational aspects. At some level, it's all shaped by Hasidism, and I'll explain that on Thursday night. So after this morning, I'll be back on Thursday night for Erev Shavuot. I'll be doing a leisurely 2-hour talk. I'll have to take it easy to get through the whole 2 hours, and I'll try to retrace our journey a little bit and go into a little bit more on the spiritual psychology of Hasidism, and hopefully in a way that will help all of you in your own spiritual quest. Then on Friday night, which is the Erev second day Shavuot, for my teaching on the Parsha of Shavuot is the Ten Commandments. I'll talk a little bit about the Ten Commandments next Friday night. One clue, the term Ten Commandments does not exist anywhere in the Torah. So one question is, where did that term come about? Why? What do we do with it? What's actually in the Bible? What's in rabbinic literature? And what does all that mean? It's a tiny part of what I want to talk about next Friday. I have to try to keep it short, of course. Then Shabbat morning, which is the morning of Shavuot, we'll go more into the depths of the idea of the divine revelation. Remember, from a Hasidic, Kabbalistic perspective, the revelation of the Ten Commandments is only the exoteric, only the, you might say, the public idea of what's happening. The inner idea is that the divine is revealing something of the divine self. And from a Hasidic perspective, as you'll see in just a moment, the divine can only reveal of its divine self if the human being is able to be present to that divine self, which is one of the core themes of Hasidism. Second day of Shavuot afternoon, we have our community gathering and the extraordinary event of my ordaining Sherry Manning, soon to be Rabbi Sherry Manning, a week from today. It's a peak event in the history of our congregation. I hope all of our members RSVP and can come. All right, so on to the movement from the Kabbalah of the Isaac Luria until Hasidism. So the main takeaway when we think about the Kabbalah of Isaac Luria is the very familiar theme of what is called the breaking of the vessels, and then Tikkun HaKelim, the rectification of the vessels. So it's as if the divine goes through a breakage. The shards of the breakage are scattered in our souls. As we do our spiritual work, we not only repair ourselves, we repair to the world. And by the way, this is obvious. Every person who's stuck in a tough moment with another person, and you hear the adage, you can't change other people, you can only change yourself. And if you change yourself enough, it's just going to change the connection between you and another person. Because whatever they're up to, they're not getting the response that they want. So if we change, either a relationship downgrades or it has to shift. Now, that's just a very basic spiritual psychological insight. We spend so much of our time wanting to change other people instead of using that time to shift ourselves, which in the end almost always has to change another person, or at least our relationship with that person. And therefore, we continuously go back to the idea of inner transformation. Whatever we're facing, with whatever we're struggling, the key is inner transformation, which has an effect on our character, which therefore has an effect on our ethical lives, our inner lives, and so forth. So the idea of the shattering of the vessels, the broken vessels residing in us, the shards are captured by klipot, husks, and our job is to break through the husk and release the spark. And there is an active force, the Ari and others would say, in the universe, called the Sitra Achra, a dark force that does not want this redemption to happen. More from a psychologizing perspective, it's the Yetzer Hara, which means there's something in us, some destructive force within us that does not want us to release the sparks, break through the klipot, and engage in transformation. So the idea of, this is one of my things I like to always stress at this point. If there's any teaching of spiritual transformation that does not include the teaching of resistance, then it's not an authentic teaching, because resistance will always come back and try to reassert itself. In fact, one of the early stories of the Baal Shem Tov, I'll say a few words about him in a moment, his students tell him, there's a new rabbi in town. He's really amazing. We all got to go study with him. So the Baal Shem Tov is a little bit skeptical. He says, well, does he have a teaching on how to permanently banish machshavot zarot, the stray thoughts of the Yetzer Hara? And they said, yes. And Baal Shem Tov says something like, well, then don't trust him. He's not a teacher. Nobody can get rid of stray thoughts. Nobody can personally banish the Yetzer Hara. If they say they do, Baal Shem Tov says, don't trust them. Don't study with them. It's a fraud. So how did the Baal Shem Tov come about? I want to give you 3 steps. One is that after the Kabbalah of Isaac Luria spreads throughout the world of those studying this esoteric Theosophy. Remember, Theosophy simply means a teaching outside of traditional theology. Theology is just a normative term, meaning the normative theology of people who study the Bible, the Talmud, etc. In Christianity, it's the normative theology created by the church fathers. Then the esoteric side is Gnosticism, Neoplatonism, and so forth. So when people study this, it's a modern term. They call theology the normative and Theosophy the more hidden. So when one studies Kabbalah in the academic setting, it is called a Theosophy. So when the Theosophy of Isaac Luria goes through the generation, it creates a messianic fervor. Why is that? Well, many scholars of the Kabbalah ask, how did the Kabbalah take this Gnostic term in the 15th, 60s, and 70s? Most attribute it to the ongoing trauma of the expulsion from Spain. It's hard for us to imagine this, but the destruction of the Jewish community in Spain and Portugal had an absolutely devastating effect on the Jewish people. Remember, that was the height of Jewish community. The golden age of Spain. Maimonides was from there. I can list one scholar after another who lived in Spain. And when the church came to power, mostly after Muslims, by the way, they wanted to get any non-Christian out of Spain, mostly directed toward the Muslims, and it included the Jews. And suddenly, within the course of just a few years, we could only compare it to the Judaism of the United States. If in just a few years, every Jew had to leave the United States, it's somewhat similar to the destruction, expulsion of Jews from Germany, but we're so focused on the Holocaust, as we should be, meaning the murder of the Jews. One would have to be particularly attentive to the incredible efflorescence of German religiosity and philosophy, and how the Jewish community intertwined in it, and the mutual echoes of Jewish philosophy and German philosophy. Again, I can give you many, many names, but many scholars who study the great German philosophers bemoan the absence of the Jews, that it was again, putting aside the physical suffering, it had a devastating effect on something that was growing to a ripening that's almost unimaginable to the way that this could have affected philosophy in the world. So it's very hard to describe, unless you go back, what effect the expulsion from Spain, how it affected the Jews of the world, especially those in the esoteric tradition. And they tried to understand with their theosophy, how could God do this? Now, that's the question of theodicy asked over and over again whenever there is evil. How could God do this? From a Gnostic approach, God is not doing it. There are klipot, there are husks. There's a sitra achra that is acting against God, and therefore we have to, as it were, and this is the radical nature of Lurianic thought, we have to empower God to overcome the sitra achra. We have to release the sparks to make God, as it were, able to exert God's will in this room. It's just a reversal of traditional theology, which would say, why did God do this? And our answer is, how do we disarm the sitra achra, the forces of the evil force of opposition and darkness, and strengthen the divine? Look what a difference this is in traditional theology. Often when anybody says to me, how could God do this? I say, I don't think God's doing anything. They say, what? You're not a rabbi? I say, yeah, I'm a rabbi, but a rabbi more in the post-Orthodox neo-Hasidic tradition that doesn't ascribe these kinds of events, these hurtful events, to the will of the divine. And for people who have not studied Hasidic psychology, Hasidic theology, Lurianic theodicy, meaning the justice of God, it's a radical new idea, but it should be familiar to just about everybody here. So in any case, in Luria's time, one way they thought about of as it were, overcoming the sitra achra and strengthening the divine, bringing tikkun, repair into the world, was through many complex meditations. I focus on the theories of Isaac Luria. I haven't taught about the practices of Luria that he taught. The practices include a large number of very complex meditations, that many of which have to do with the letters of the divine name. In fact, when I look at my Lurianic Sidur, every page, every bracha is its own coded way to do meditations on the divine name. So the idea is, if we all do these meditations enough, it will disarm the sitra achra, will break through the husk, release the sparks, bring redemption, which means the Messiah will come. So there was a time of messianic expectation, which of course came to its peak in the so-called heretical Messiah Shabtai Tzvi in 1666. I won't go into that, other than he proclaimed himself the Messiah. He was born in Izmir. He proclaimed himself in Messiah in Gaza with his student Natan. It was a fiasco. You can read Gershom Sholom's book on Shabtai Tzvi. In any case, it turns out that, this will surprise none of you, he actually was not the Messiah. The world did not end. The inner life of the divine was not repaired. He became a Muslim. He had to convert to Islam under threat of death. Many of his followers became Muslims. They retreated into the Balkans, and even the heretical messianism of Shabtai Tzvi was another great injury to the soul of the people of Israel, if you can imagine this idea. First, the expulsion from Spain, messianism, Isaac Luria that gave a method for bringing the Messiah, Shabtai Tzvi claiming to be the Messiah, the great fall of Shabtai Tzvi, and you can't even imagine how many Jews and others thought that Shabtai Tzvi would bring the end of the world, that he was the Messiah. I have a lot more to say about that another time. So now try to imagine that the spiritual Jewish world is in tatters at the end of the 1600s. And there are, as you can imagine, many people asking, what are we going to do? Because the idea of engaging in complex Lurianic meditations to bring the Messiah just had a bad taste. When you've heard that you can't study Kabbalah till you're 40, those kinds of things, as far as I know, this all happened after Shabtai Tzvi. They didn't want people getting into this because it leads to disasters, especially when someone, typically a male, would say, I'm the Messiah. So what you find here is the repression of public Kabbalistic study by any young person unless they were authorized to do so by the elders of the community. In any case, now we come to Israel ben Eliezer. Israel ben Eliezer is a Jew who lives in what we would call today Russia, Poland, Ukraine, that part. It was the borders were very, very fluid at the time. And the tradition is he's born in about 1700, some say 1698, sometimes 1700. And when you look at the stories of the Baal Shem Tov, he reveals himself at the age of 36 years old. There's dispute about this. Some say when he's 26, some say when he's 46. But in any case, he is a Kabbalist. He knows the Kabbalah. He knows Isaac Luria. At a certain point in his life, he writes a letter to his brother-in-law that has been preserved, by the way, where he said, I was brought up into the higher chambers. This is called Aliyat HaNeshama. I was brought up into the higher chambers. I was brought into the chamber of the Messiah, who's studying Torah. The Messiah says to me, you will be given the secrets. You're permitted to teach the secrets, but you have to do it in a secret way. But you have to get these secrets out to everybody. And again, I'm summarizing and paraphrasing the letter, the sense that everybody has to know the secrets, but now everybody can understand the secrets. You have to teach it in a way that everybody understands it by their own means. So according to the understanding, the Baal Shem Tov goes around. He gathers around him a very sophisticated school of Kabbalists and instructs them, stop with the Lurianic meditations. We have to bring this down to its essence. We're going to study this, and then we're going to bring it out to those who can understand it. They'll understand the depth of the message. Every person will understand it according to their ability. But I've been instructed by God, by the Messiah, to get this out. There's a lot more to say about this, and if I do an extended course on Hasidism, which I'm very tempted to do, I'll tell you much more about that. So the Baal Shem Tov creates this circle around him, and he is an itinerant preacher. By the way, he's an amulet maker by profession. The Baal Shem Tov, or a Baal Shem, means an amulet maker. He's a Baal Shem Tov, so he's an excellent amulet maker, and that's his cover. His cover is he's appealing to the attraction toward magic in Eastern Europe. By the way, if we jump 100 years ahead, 150 years ahead, with the secularization of Judaism in the 1800s, many Hasidic rabbis became magicians. This sounds crazy, but if you look in the literature of Ricky Jay, Lava Shalom, of blessed memory, we actually studied magic together, and he discovered this, and he said, Rabbi Finley, what's up with Hasidic rabbis when they lost their jobs, became magicians? I said, man, oh man, you've hit on something incredible. We spent many hours talking about it. You can find it in his books. But there is a strongly magical dimension to the Kabbalah, and therefore a magical dimension in the Hasidic movement, which turned into a deep interest in the world that we would call performed magic. Whole other story, I'll tell you that another time. So in any case, the Baal Shem Tov wants to, although his public job is an amulet maker, what he's really teaching is spiritual transformation. They end up de-emphasizing magic. They de-emphasize Lurianic meditations, and they want to get to the spiritual core of things. So this is the work of the Baal Shem Tov. Gershom Scholem calls this the neutralization of messianism. He says, we're not doing meditations to bring the Messiah. If we want to bring the Messiah, we change our inner lives. We change our conduct. So this is called the movement from transcendence, which means we're trying to solve a divine problem, as it were, save the divine, transfers into the only way to heal the divine is to heal ourselves. To heal ourselves, we would call it inner regulation, character improvement, including many other things as well. So let me give you now, formally give you a few of those steps. What is Hasidic psychology based on? In many ways means, what is the foundation of spiritual life that I'm teaching everyone here? So I have a very fine book by an Israeli author named Yoram Yaakovson, or Yoram Jacobson in English. And in this book, Hasidic Thought, I'm on in the introduction, pages 16 and 17, he gives four themes of the of what created Hasidism, and then the book develops those themes throughout. So again, more or less repeating what I said, he says, the particular emphasis placed on immanence or the presence of the divine. So if you look at traditional Kabbalah, there's a sense of transcendence. The drama, the Lurianic drama is going on in the inner life of God. We are down here trying to influence the inner life of God. Hasidism comes around and says, you don't have to worry about the inner life of God. We don't have to do meditations. It's called theurgy. We don't have to do meditations that, as it were, work on the divine. We work on ourselves. That automatically works on the divine. So the question is immanence, not the transcendence of the divine, but the immanence of the divine, meaning the divine is within each person. So we have to, as it were, address the divine spirit within, and therefore live our lives in such a way that the divine is not banished from consciousness, that the divine is not disarmed, immobilizing its inherent urging for us to change our lives. So the problem isn't redeeming God anymore. The problem is bringing redemption to the self through managing the inner life and changing our character. What's the evidence that you've actually done this work? Well, to put it in terms of what I call wisdom work, capacity for self-regulation, capacity for managing your thoughts, feelings, emotions, speech, and behavior, shift of character, and whether you live your life in such a way that you make an abode for the soul, which is the divine presence, and you live your life in such a way that you are a blessing for other people. That's the idea of immanence, is what many people call the God within. That is a Hasidic idea. So if you've ever said, I don't believe in the God out there, I believe in the God in here, it's a Hasidic idea. The idea of pnimiyut, the inwardness of the divine experience. Second thing, as I said earlier, he says the psychologization of the theosophic contents of Kabbalah, especially Luria. So remember, the Theosophy is turned into psychology, but psychology in its original sense, the logos of the psyche, the teaching of the soul. So this is psychology, you might say, in its most ideal sense, is the transformation of the inner life. I'm not putting down clinical psychology, but you might say when you look at psychology from a very, very wide angle, it's about transformation. And from a spiritual psychological perspective, which is why I used to call my work spiritual psychology, it assumes the soul, it assumes the existence of God, and it assumes a divine interest in our transformation. Most psychology doesn't talk about that. What I call spiritual psychology does. And anybody who refers to themselves as interested in spiritual psychology, you'll probably notice a strong spiritual dimension, not just a clinical psychological dimension, and you will probably notice some reference to the experience of the divine. Third is the Hasidic doctrine of dvekut. So the doctrine of dvekut, which means devek in Hebrew means glue, and it's the idea of deep attachment to the divine. So notice this is different from non-attachment, something that you find in Eastern schools of thought. The Hasidic idea is reattachment. You're not attached to outcomes. You're not attached to changing people. I call that tertiary when I teach my spiritual psychology. At a third level out, I do want to change other people. At a third level out, I do want to change society. I do want to change culture. I want things to get better. I'll talk about that in just a moment. So, but I call that my tertiary, the third level out, because if that's the first level in my own inner temple, I will spend my life frustrated, depressed, or angry. Try to imagine that in the core of my being, what I care about is changing other people, changing the world, changing culture, changing society. If that's your soul, you are in very big trouble. So part of this is you're not, again, at the core level number one, you don't focus so much on changing everybody else. You just got to get straight with yourself. And part of the Hasidic idea in this idea of devekut, what inhibits us from lives of devekut? Number one, you might say the world of lies, olama de shikara. We lie to ourselves. We're not honest with ourselves. We make things up. We're so focused on changing other people and changing the world, we never get straight with ourselves. Now, this is a strong idea in spiritual psychology, all the way from the Bible to the Talmud. Remember the famous phrase that says, beautify yourself, then try to beautify others. And the Aramaic word kashot means both beauty and truth. Isn't that wonderful? There's an argument in the Talmud, and one rabbi says, kashot atzmecha acharcha kashot acherim. Make yourself into a beautiful person. Make yourself into a person of truth. Then you can go around and try to make other people beautiful and truthful. So why don't people feel davuk, cleaving to God? Not because there's no God, because we're not straightened out with Him. God is there. As when I put this in one of my first papers that I wrote when I learned about this, it's not that God is not present. We're not present. If we could be fully present, then the devekut between us and the divine would be manifest. So the question of experiencing the divine, you can say the authentic self, you can say experience the soul, pick any synonym you want. What stops us from experiencing our souls? What stops us from experiencing the divine? It's not that the divine is not here. I'm always remember, at this point, I always mention that brilliant New Yorker cartoon. A man is kneeling next to his bed, hands prayer, and the cartoonist brilliantly drew a smug man who clearly had a very high estimation of himself. And the line is, God, I've asked you many times to change me, but apparently you couldn't be bothered. Okay, so that captured me so well, this idea, put it in the hands of God. It's not in the hands of God. This is one of the problems I have with traditional AA thought. Again, I think AA is a beautiful system. The idea of hand it over to God, that's against, for me, Hasidic spiritual psychology. I don't hand it over to God. I do my own work and I present my work to God. Now, again, AA, if you go into it enough, it has a kind of a Protestant Christian feel to it that we accept grace and grace transforms us. I get it. I mean, I can explain it enough to make it work. But I would never say that. If a person said to me, came with my struggles with addiction, my struggles with alcohol, do I just turn it over to God? I said, it doesn't quite look like that for me. What it looks like for me is work on my inner life enough that the divine light within me can flow through me, overcome the Yetzer Hara, overcome the darkness, overcome the chaos and void, fight against the Sitra Achra, so that the cravings aren't my way to make myself emotionally feel better. One reason we are so toxic in our thoughts, feelings, and emotions from a spiritual psychological perspective is because the Yetzer Hara and the Sitra Achra have taken over. So again, from this perspective, you don't turn it over to God. You might say God has given you the tools to get that work done, but you have to do that work yourself. This would be, I think, would be an authentic, Hasidic spiritual psychological perspective, which, by the way, I brought when I taught for many years at a rehab center. I was perfectly licensed to bring this in. They said, you don't have to be a company man. You teach what you teach, and we're very glad to have someone who can teach another approach, because many people, the 12 steps don't resonate to them. So we would love you to teach something that will resonate to them. So your interpretation of the 12 steps is largely invited. So I'm not saying this is against 12 steps. It's a different interpretation. All right, so we have the idea of immanence. We have the idea of the psychologization of Lurianic Theosophy. We have the idea of devekut. And the last one I will bring up is the peculiar Hasidic idea of the tzaddik. Peculiar meaning it really only existed in the first few generations of Hasidism, and I think was rooted in the following problem. The work I am teaching is very sophisticated work. It is not for everybody. I have to tell you, I've gone out and given what I thought were basic talks on this, and people say, I couldn't understand what you were saying. I turned my vocabulary down. I use words that only had 2 syllables. I spoke, I thought as clearly as possible. Is that people just glaze over. I don't understand what you're saying. Now, present company accepted, of course, because you zoomed in on a Shabbat morning for this. But I thought to myself, well, what can I do? So I thought about the Baal Shem Tov. He told stories. This was Rabbi Nachman's stories. Stories pass right through the intellect and go straight to the soul. That's what literature does. Now, any great literature, including cinema, poetry, music, art, etc. But for me, it's especially the written word. For me, especially literature and poetry. In a way, especially poetry, you might say, or any great literature, it bypasses the conscious mind because the whole idea of poetry, it doesn't appeal to prosaic thinking. It passes through, you might say, limited, rational, prosaic thinking, goes straight into the soul. And then our question is, how do we translate this? So we experience this every Friday night when we study poetry, which is one reason we're so glad that, in my opinion, that we study poetry every Friday night, because it is the royal path to the soul, which can then open us up to transformation. The problem with virtually all poetry that I've read, it doesn't give you a method. It doesn't give you a method for transformation. So poetry, archetypal study of scripture, all opens up the soul, but you have to have a method waiting for you. The soul gets energized. That energy has to get like mechanically. You apply the energy to a mechanism that begins to do its work, to gears that began to change. You need the energy to get the mechanism to work, but the energy without the mechanism is great energy, but it doesn't translate in the mechanics of the interlife. It has to translate to a method for transformation, which is one of the core concerns that I bring to this work and one of the core concerns of our congregation. It's not enough to have a spiritual insight. A spiritual insight is pure energy. What are the mechanics of transformation? How do you plug that energy into, as it were, the machinery of transformation? Now, the machinery of transformation without spirituality can be somewhat dead. It'll just run out of energy. But energy without the mechanism of transformation, I think, just dissipates itself. So when you look at the early generations of Hasidism, they're talking to very simple people who did not understand. I mean, they didn't live in a post-Freudian world. And even today, in a post-Freudian world with so much spiritual psychology going on, I still meet people that say, I have no idea what you're talking about. The best I can do is tell a story. So now try to think of Eastern Europe in the 1700s, where they realized they couldn't teach this stuff, only to the very elect. But what they could say to the people is, trust me. Connect yourself to my teaching. Just do what I ask you to do. I'm not going to do anything to hurt you. But if you do what I ask you to do, to the best of your ability, you will find your way to your soul. So people say, well, what do you mean by the soul? So now, by the way, I think that's a distraction. What do you mean by the soul? So you want now to have a long talk about a theoretical discussion of love, justice, truth, and beauty? You know what my experience has been? Whenever you try to define love, justice, truth, and beauty to a skeptic, you can talk for days and never get anywhere. You're just going around and around, the guinea pig wheel. There's no traction. There's no traction for movement forward. So I find this with intellectual skeptics, by the way, which was a Hasidic problem toward the end of the 1800s. Their problem was not the simplicity of the folk in rural Poland or the Ukraine. The problem was sophisticated people who would come and ask the Rebbe questions, couldn't get definitions. They went on their way with no spiritual improvement whatsoever. So at some point, the Rebbe would say, they called it tzaddik, you attach yourself to me, let me guide you, and you will find the transformation. By the way, just to give you a practical life example, I've told this story often. It's just an analogy. So, I did karate all my life, as I've said many times. I was in my early 40s when I watched the UFC, United Ultimate Fighting Championship, where the Gracie Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu showed up and they beat all the karate guys. I said, oh no, they can beat every karate guy they come in touch with. So I wanted to study Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. I waited until Avigal was old enough that I didn't have to be part of the team. And Avigal, I think you turned 3. I said, okay, that's it. I'm going to go study Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. So I walk in. I was 50 pounds overweight. And by the way, jogging does not put you in shape. Karate is not the way that you learn at your local studio is not really going to get you through a fight unless you get to an intense black belt level. I come in, I wrestle with a couple of guys. I'm a big guy. In those days, I was really big. I could bench press 300. There are guys 100 pounds less than me that just worked me in seconds. I said, okay, what is this magic? Can I possibly do this? So I looked at the coach and I said, I don't know. He says, you show up twice a week, leave the rest to me. I said, really? You mean like someday I can be like one of those guys? Like just like swim through this stuff? He goes, yeah, you just keep showing up. I said, okay, I'm putting my life in your hands. It took a while. I began training in 2015. I got my black belt after a heart attack and back injuries and a million other things. I just stayed at it. And I got my black belt. But I remember the day he said, trust me, put yourself in my hands, do what I tell you to do. I went, I'm a former Marine. I said, yes, sir. And that was it. So try to imagine the tzaddik. You come to the tzaddik and says, I want this transformation. I want to be able to do that of which you speak. And that's what I see other people doing. I want to be in that. The tzaddik says, just trust me, do what I say. And if you don't think you can trust me, just ask everybody else. And everybody else says, yeah, you can trust this person. They have a method. But don't ask a million questions that are going to distract you. By the way, that's something you don't do in jiu-jitsu is keep asking questions. So just say, look, can you just drill? I'll take your questions after class, but don't stop the drills with a million questions. And I just do the drills and, do the moves. One of the classic things in jiu-jitsu when I work with a beginner, we'd be doing something and then they would say, okay, spar. And they wouldn't make any progress because I'm a black belt, right? I hope they can't make any progress. They raise their hand and say to the coach, this doesn't work. That's one of the most comical things you can ever hear in a jiu-jitsu club is a white belt complaining to the coach that this doesn't work because they can't defeat a black belt. Just try to imagine that. So if somebody comes to me and says, this prayer thing doesn't work. This study thing doesn't work. All the things you're teaching, none of it works. So my response is, you're a white belt. It's not supposed to work. Maybe every now and then you'll have a flash of brilliance and inspiration, but you got to go up through the system. You got to go one step at a time. So if it worked, if every beginner could make it work consistently, you wouldn't need schools. People just go out and make it work. You could get it from a book. So when you want to know why the tzaddik, why the idea of the Rabbi, they lived in a time that people didn't either have the knowledge because they were too simple, let's say the folk in rural Ukraine, or they were too sophisticated, which means they learned ideas that banish whatever capacity they had for the divine out of their heads. So in both of them, they need to find a teaching that, number one, will disarm the harmful sophistication on one hand, and on the other hand, help make people who think in a simple way think in just a sophisticated enough way for their hearts to open to the spirituality that they are talking about. So these are the 4 things that Jacobson says characterized Hasidism from the very beginning. Immanence, not focusing on the transcendent of the divine, but the immanence of the divine. Spiritual psychology as opposed to Theosophy. I had number 3 in front of me. Maybe somebody can remind me. My short-term memory is fugues out now and then. Hold on a second. Okay. Number 3 is dveikut, as I said before. The constant work to make yourself able to connect with the divine. And again, the opposition is the Yetzer Hara, the Sitra Achra. That's where the fight is. Sometimes when people say, I tried what you said and I couldn't get to it. That's where the fight is. You just ran up against the Yetzer Hara. The question is, as Rabbi Nachman of Bratslav says, Tachsisei Milchama, spiritual warriorship. That's where the fight is. So the idea of Devekut, which includes, for me, spiritual warriorship, and then the doctrine of the Tzaddik. All right, in my last few minutes here before I take questions, I want to remind you of a two very basic teachings of the Baal Shem Tov, which characterize early Hasidism. Remember, the Baal Shem Tov never wrote anything down. He died, if I'm not mistaken, in 1760. His senior student, Dober of Mezerich, took over. That first generation tried to formalize his teachings. Dober of Mezerich dies in 1772. And finally, a few of the other senior teachers, notably Yaakov Yosef of Polonia, they wrote as much as they could down, gave it to publishers. So you might say the Hasidic movement, has many beginnings. The Baal Shem Tov, Dober of Mezerich, but with the publication of what people remembered of the Baal Shem Tov in 1772, in many ways really begins the Hasidic movement. All right, so when I read from, for example, it says Baal Shem Tov, this book, he didn't write it. As far as I know, Dober Mezrich didn't write it. It was the later students who took everything they remembered that the Baal Shem Tov taught, that Dober Mezrich taught, and they worked together to compose, for example, this book, which is called the Baal Shem Tov. Now, this is a teaching of which most of you should be familiar, but is a teaching that I love every time I read it, even if you know it well. It's something to review. And this is, again, his students reconstructing the Baal Shem Tov's comment on the story of Noah, where God says to Noah to put a Sohar in the ark. And you look at the commentary, people ask, well, is the Sohar a light or a luminous gemstone? So I thought to myself, I don't think there are any gemstones that are just inherently luminous, maybe except for amber or something. And then as I was teaching this one time, I want to thank our synagogue member, Richard Abuza, who said, Rabbi Finley, I looked it up. There's something called a deck prism. Wow. So I looked it up. Apparently, the way that you got light into the lower decks was you embedded a big prism on the upper deck where the sun could shine on it, and then it shed light into the lower decks. Remember, there were 3 decks in the ark. So when you hear the word Sohar, it's not a light or a gem. It's a gem lighted by the sun so it can shine onto lower decks. Okay? And again, I want to thank you, Richard. By the way, I've bought several prisms since then. I put light under them so I can, in my contemplative practice, use the idea of put a light in the ark through the deck prism. Okay, now I'm just going to give you a few tiny levels. I have the text in front of me. I'm not going to read and comment. I'll just do it from the outside. So it says, put a light in the Teva. Most of you know where I'm going. For the beginners, I'll have to explain to you. The Hebrew word Teva, which means a container. For example, Noah's Ark was Tevat Noah, the container of Noah. Moses was put in a Teva, a vessel. In modern Israel, your post office box is called a Tevat Doar. So the word Teva means a container. So when you look in the story of Noah's Ark, it says, put a light in the ark, which really means put a Sohar, a deck prism, on the so-called the barge, the container. Okay, step 1. Step 2, in rabbinic Hebrew, the word Teva means the orthographic word. Now, as far as I know, we don't have a distinction in English, but try to imagine there's the written form of the word, and then there's the semantic value of the word. So when you look at a word, you see its written form, but you might say within it is the semantic value. So let's say justice. I mean, I can identify the letters Justice. Okay, those are the tevot. That's the teva. Those are the letters, the phonology, as it were. So I can identify it in writing. But the milah, which has to do with the semantic dimension, is buried inside the word. So the word Teva now means the orthographic word. Now look at how we translate that line in Noah, according to the Baal Shem Tov. Put a light into the orthographic word so you can see the lower decks of the Teva. Just as Noah's Ark had 3 decks, every word, as it were, has 3 decks, but you can't see into the lower decks of the Teva unless there's a light. So who puts that light? We do. You take a word, and again, in the exposition here is specifically words of the prayer book and words of the Torah, not the Zohar, by the way, not mystical text, just the text that you might say that any practicing Jew used daily or can get a hold of. Every one of you can get a prayer book. Every one of you can get a Bible or the Torah, without and read it in your native language. He says the problem is when people pick up their prayer book, as you've seen many times, maybe complained about it, they're just cruising through it at the freeway speed limit, autostrada, as they say in Israel, without ever pausing. It's just get through it. And so they're saying, actually stop, pull off. That word you're looking at, it's an opening to a cave. Pull off. Drive up to the entrance of the cave. Let's take the word atah. You. Baruch atah. Sometimes I hear Baruch atah Adonai. I get the heebie-jeebies. I get smarmeret. Like, okay, yeah, I understand why we're doing it like that. But just try to imagine you read the word atah and meant it. You've heard me say this many times, because that happened to me. When I read this and I slowed down, I said, Baruch atah. That's the Teva. I know how to say it. I know how to read it. Stop. Right now it's like this. There's 3 decks. I'm going to put a deck prism, and I'm going to go inside the word. The next time you say the word atah in any bracha, lighting candles, whatever, you stop at the word atah, you put in the deck prism, you go down inside, and the Baal Shem Tov says, you discover in there, and there are various versions, angels, worlds, and souls. Malachim, olamot, unefashot. There's a few different versions. And you go down inside that word, you're saying you to the divine. You now put the deck prism into the word and you go down in there. It's a mystical experience. You will discover the root of your soul. So the Baal Shem Tov in his commentary is an extended commentary on the term, put a Sohar in the Teva, put a deck prism in the ark, in the container, in the orthographic word, look down into all the decks of the word and see what's there. The idea is that every word, and again, why the prayer book? Because everybody had one. Why the Chumash? Why the 5 books of Moses? Everybody had one. You don't have to own the Talmud. You don't have to own the Zohar. This is actually where it might be complex to you, but these are the simplest texts in the Jewish tradition. And when you put a Sohar in the Teva, when you put a deck prism into each word, and you go down into the depths of the word, and then you come up, and then you put a deck prism into a set of words, into a few words, let's say, of the prayer book. And then you put the deck prism into a sentence from the prayer book. And then you put the deck prism into a unit of the prayer book. The poetic depths of the word, of the sentence, of the bracha just pour out. There are times when I daven, I did one word, one sentence, one bracha, and hispically, that was enough. I couldn't go on anymore because it so filled me. And by the way, that is my spiritual practice. I do maybe a couple lines from Tehillim, a couple lines from somewhere in the prayer book. I sometimes open it quite randomly. I look at the Hebrew, I memorize it, I go inside, I put a deck prism into the words that are asking me to put the deck prism. I do my contemplative preparation, the breathing. I put my mind on the word, put the deck prism in the word opens up, it flows up, and it's powerful. Now remember, what I have to do with that energy is engaged in transformation. So the last book I want to bring up is The Ethical Will of the Baal Shem Tov. It's called Tzva'at HaRibash, The Ethical Will of Rabbi Yisrael Baal Shem Tov. You can find it in English, by the way. You can go do a search and say The Ethical Will of the Baal Shem Tov. It's really not his ethical will. It's his students' collected sayings that they compose into the basic teachings of the Baal Shem Tov. So the word tziva'ah is not really the right word. It's a will. You might say it's the spiritual instructions of the Baal Shem Tov. So when people think of Hasidus, they oftentimes think of emotionality, spontaneity, dance, and joy. In the very first instruction that he gives, if I remember correctly, he says, on the first page, Tamid ledabek et asmo b'midot tovot v'hanhagot yesharot musar. You should always glue yourself, attach yourself to midot, character ethics, midot tovot, character ethics, hanhagot, specific practices, hanhagot yesharot, straight spiritual practices attached to character ethics. So this is the beginning of the way the students put together the spiritual instructions of the Baal Shem Tov. That's actually the second piece of advice. The first one is you should be tamim in your avodah, in your spiritual work. V'ha'ikar, and the main thing is shelo lishkoach devarim. Don't forget anything. I want you to think about this for a moment. Many people say, yeah, I learned that, but I forgot it. Well, forgetfulness is a natural, and from a Hasidic perspective, it's part of the work of the Yetzer Hara to drive things out of your memory. Try to imagine. There's something in you when you learn a deep spiritual insight, and you say, wow, I really get it now. And the next day you say, wow, what exactly did I think? I forgot. The Yetzer Hara drove it out of you. That's where the war is. So this is why, as in every spiritual tradition, the profundity of memorization, which is why I like to eat just a few verses. Ner Adonai Nishmat Adam. Anybody who's been around Oral Torah for more than a couple of days, Ner Adonai Nishmat Adam. The light of God is the human soul. You put a deck prism in that, just about everything that I've received from Hasidism and brought over to you, it's there. So know 3 or 4 lines from the Bible. Know them well. Chant them. Meditate on them. That's number 1. Don't forget anything. Memorize it, even just a couple of things. Secondly, make sure it translates to midot tovot, character ethics, and hanhagot yesharot. And a hanhaga is a spiritual practice, a straight spiritual practice, not going to distract you, not going to mislead you. Look at, just the first 2 lines of the spiritual discipline of the Baal Shem Tov. You don't need to go beyond that. I've taught the whole book, I think, one time in my life to graduate students. I don't mind teaching it again. It's a wonderful book to read. So what I tried to give you today is we look at that complex theosophy of Isaac Luria, and the cosmogony, and the breaking of the vessels, and the sparks and the husks and all that. Take all of that, and Baal Shem Tov gets a vision and says, yeah, it's all true, and the meditations are great. Baal Shem Tov says, those meditations don't work anymore. Don't stop doing them. They're no longer effective. They were effective in Isaac Luria's time. They're no longer effective today. Everybody stop it. And he gathers with his students, these sophisticated Kabbalists, says, we got to drill this down to something simple, both for ourselves and to teach other people. Mostly because they are teaching folk people, we have to teach them to be convinced that we know what we're doing. Create a teaching. Teach them that the main thing is dveikut. Yes, you can change other people. You can change the world. This is one of my biggest complaints about Reform Judaism. This tikkun olam, tikkun olam, tikkun olam. Fix the world, fix the world, fix the world. I say, what about tikkun hanefesh? One of the greatest mistakes of Reform Judaism in my mind, they didn't begin with tikkun hanefesh. Start by straightening out your soul. Start by creating hanhagot yisharot, solid inner life practices, then go out and change the world. And this idea, I remember I was a rabbi at a big Reform synagogue. When I mentioned this stuff, they said, well, is that Reform Judaism? Are we supposed to change the world? I said, yeah, it's not like serial, not, like change yourself and then change the world, but at least be involved in self-transformation before you go out and change the world. Why? Because you got to make sure you're not lying. You got to make sure you're not making some grievous mistake. You got to make sure that your theories are valid. If you start with mistaken thinking, mistaken values, go to try to change the world, you'll do more damage than good. So from a very early age in my development, when I was in college, I got this from Gershom Scholem, studied with a Hasidic teacher since I was in my mid-20s, and it is, it's my religion. It's my core religiosity. So today we've actually gotten at what I'm going to call a few elements of Hasidic psychology. I've given you just a couple of texts to think about. One is put a Sohar in the Teva, bring a light to any word that you study, even just one word. And I brought you the beginning of the Baal Shem Tov's spiritual discipline, which is memorize. First thing he says, memorize. It's a fight. The Yetzer Hara does not want you to memorize. And number two, cultivate good character and solid spiritual practices. You're on your way.